seated. We could begin. So I'm John Cogan, senior fellow here at Hoover. And let me introduce our topic today with a few remarks. I'll focus on the United States, but my comments apply in varying degrees to the fiscal circumstances faced by most advanced countries. U.S. fiscal policy is on a dangerous path. For more than a half a century, the United States government has continually run annual budget deficits. The only exception to this unprecedented 50-year-plus string is a brief 4-year period of surpluses during the dot-com boom. Recent Congresses and presidents have worked particularly hard to make sure that we continue down this perilous path. When the United States Treasury closes its books at the end of the current fiscal year, it will report that federal spending, excluding interest on the public debt, is about $6 trillion. This amount is 50% higher than it was just 6 years ago in 2019, right before the pandemic. Add in interest payments, and the increase rises to 60%. That temporary surge in government spending during the pandemic is now in the process of becoming a permanent fixture in the U.S. budget. The U.S. now faces primary deficits of $1 trillion that, in the absence of any fiscal restraint or any tax increase, will soon become $2 trillion, and then $3 trillion. Now, it'd be one thing if these deficits were used to finance investments in the future. But in the U.S., only 5% of federal spending goes for non-defense infrastructure projects, R&D, education programs. Most expenditures consist of transfer payments. Both history and economics teach us that the path that we are on will ultimately have serious adverse economic consequences. So, what are these consequences? How will they manifest themselves? Can they be avoided? Is there a way off the current fiscal path? What role can monetary policy play in alleviating any adverse effects that are likely to come from continuing down this path, or from trying to get off it? What market signals should the Fed pay attention to identify emerging debt-related economic problems? What signals should it not pay attention to? Definitive answers to these questions, and I'm sure the ones you have, will be provided by our expert panel here. We have Auerbach from UC Berkeley, Michael Boskin from the Hoover Institution, Hanno Lustig from the Stanford Business School, and John Cochrane from Hoover. Alan, you want to kick it off?
Well, I'm particularly glad that this conference includes this session on fiscal policy. That's usually the only time I get invited to conferences on monetary policy. And it's particularly nice this year because I get to help celebrate John Taylor's contributions. I've been concerned about U.S. deficits for about 35 years and warning about the dangers of continuing to run them. So I may have lost credibility at this point. But I'm here to argue that this time is different. And I've got several reasons for saying so. First of all, the debt to GDP ratio where we have right now of about 1 is substantially higher. It's about 3 times what it was before the financial crisis. And while we talked about deficits and our concerns about deficit spending in years before that, if you look at the patterns of the debt to GDP ratio leading up to the financial crisis, it tended to ebb and flow, but there was no obvious pattern. Since then, we've had basically 2 big jumps in the debt to GDP ratio. One associated with the financial crisis, and the other associated with COVID. And notably, those jumps, unlike, for example, the jump during World War II, those jumps were not succeeded by any reversal. The U.S. had an all-time high debt to GDP ratio, publicly held debt, of a bit over 100% at the end of World War II, and of course it fell quite rapidly after that. But the big jump that we had in the aftermath, during and after the financial crisis, and then again during the COVID-induced recession, were not reversed. We basically, in each case, reached a new plateau of the debt to GDP ratio. And so we really have less room to maneuver than we did in past periods when we, at least for a period of years, ran large deficits. The second thing that's different now is that we have larger primary deficits built into our forecasts than in the past. The last 3 fiscal years, last 3 completed fiscal years, we've had primary deficits of over 3% of GDP. That is unprecedented in the post-war period, except for periods during and immediately after recessions. So, for example, that we had 4 years during and after immediately after the financial crisis, 2 years, the 2 fiscal years when COVID hit, and then 1983, which was just in the aftermath of a very deep recession. Except for those years, we haven't had primary deficits of more than 3%. We've had them for the last 3 fiscal years during a period of pretty good economic performance. Now, if one looks at the Congressional Budget Office projections going forward, the primary deficits fall below 3%. But there's a big asterisk next to that, which is that those are based on current law, which includes the expiration of virtually all of the 2017 tax cuts. If one incorporates those tax cuts in the forecast, the primary deficits jump way above 3% again. And they continue, and throughout the next several years, leading, by my calculations with Bill Gale in a recent paper, to a projected debt to GDP ratio, again, publicly held, not gross debt to GDP ratio, at the end of basically the current decade through 2035 of 134%. Now remember, the all-time high debt to GDP ratio was 106% in 1946. And of course, the difference between 1946 and 2035 is that there's no prospect without major changes in policy of a decline. There's no peace dividend this time. That already happened. There's not another peace dividend on the way. The third thing that makes this time different is that Congress has stopped responding to budget conditions. In a paper that Danny Yeagan and I did for the Brookings panel in the fall, we analyzed fiscal feedback rules following the same procedures that I'd used in a Brookings paper a little over 20 years ago. And in my original paper, I found that that there were strong legislative reactions to larger projected budget deficits. In particular, larger budget deficits led to legislation that adopted fiscal consolidation on both the tax side and the spending side. And that was pretty constant throughout the 1980s and 90s and into the early part of this century. But sometime within the last couple of decades, that responsiveness entirely evaporated, to the point that Congress no longer responds at all to fiscal conditions. No matter how large the projected deficits are, it doesn't lead to any kind of difference in policy. And one only has to look, as an example, at the difference between the tax policy process in 2017 and now. So under the same president, so political conditions not obviously different. In 2017, there was concern about the size of the deficit, additions to the deficit that would be caused by the tax cuts. There was a target of $1.5 trillion over 10 years, and in the reconciliation process, there were attempts to find certain sources of revenue to lessen the problem. In 2025, Congress has adopted a so-called current policy baseline, which says that tax cuts that extend existing previous tax cuts have no effect and therefore don't have to be any cause for concern. And we don't really have can't really have any confidence that the very large tax cuts that will be coming as a result of extension of the 2017 legislation, as well as additional measures that have been added to that, will be offset in any significant way by reductions in federal spending. And so we're going to have a very large, probably bigger than the 134% debt to GDP ratio that I mentioned. And I should say also that that projection doesn't incorporate any responsiveness of the debt service costs that is, it incorporates additional debt service costs, but not any increase in interest rates with respect to the debt to GDP ratio. Incorporating that would exacerbate the increase in the debt to GDP ratio. And the final thing I would say that is different is that we are, rather than sort of relying on our exorbitant privilege to lessen the cost of debt service, we have an administration that is, as has already been discussed here today, that is pushing against that and viewing the very strong demand for U.S. Assets as a curse rather than a blessing, which presumably is going to increase the cost of debt service to the extent that it spooks foreign investors. Of course, we add to all this all of which is going to put a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve. I mean, it's also going to lead to demands, and already has, for monetary accommodation. Whether this time is different in terms of Fed independence is for others to say, who are more expert on the politics of monetary policy than I. But I think that certainly contributes to the challenge we face now that really makes it different than in other cases where we've worried about deficits. So to the extent that this plays out in an increase in either in monetary accommodation or through some other mechanism, higher inflation, I just want to add one final point, which is that inflation, there's very little of a silver lining here in terms of inflation's effect on our fiscal problems. We tend to think that because of most of the national debt is not indexed, that a sudden burst of inflation will help our fiscal picture. And indeed, the debt to GDP ratio did go down during the run-up inflation associated with COVID. It actually improved even though we were running large deficits during that period. That may happen again, but it's worth pointing out that even with a substantial reduction in the debt to GDP ratio because of rapid, unexpected inflation, we will still face a daunting fiscal challenge because of the very, very high primary deficits that extend out as far as the eye can see under any realistic projections. And one should keep in mind that these primary deficits are real. They're basically determined in real terms. Because we have an indexed tax system, because our major expenditures, such as old age entitlement programs and national defense, which occupy the lion's share of the federal budget, are all marked in real terms rather than nominal terms. Social Security, because Social Security benefits are indexed to the price level. Healthcare, because the cost of healthcare is based on the delivery of services, not on nominal budgets. And defense for the same reason, because we determine what it costs to provide national defense based on what it costs to pay soldiers and procure weapons, and those things are not determined not in nominal terms but in real terms. So we may have, because of the unusual circumstances that we face, we may have excessive pressure on monetary policy, and we may see additional inflation, in part because of that. But even if we do see that inflation, we are still going to have massive fiscal challenges that we are currently nowhere near addressing. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan, for that uplifting message. Michael?
I may not be much more uplifting than Alan. However, I want to provide some additional context. I think I'm going to dispense with virtually all of my slides so I can get through the material a little more quickly. I want to emphasize several points. First, looking at the historical data, there are some very important things to appreciate. Number one, that what governments actually do in the real world in the advanced democracies has changed markedly over time. They're primarily redistributors of income through transfer payments and social insurance, not purchases of goods and services, including defense. So it's important, and building roads, et cetera. That still goes on, but those were, in the Eisenhower administration, that was 80% of non-interest spending. Now it's a minority of non-interest spending. Second, that something Alan mentioned, but a large fraction of our budget is on autopilot. We, with an anodyne phrase, call them entitlements, but they're not just that they continue, but they actually schedule to grow. And we badly need to have a debate about whether we want them to guarantee a real level of income, or that, for example, Social Security payments should rise by 25% every generation. We don't do that. We really haven't engaged on that kind of a conversation in many, many years. So that, in addition, that makes things more difficult. I do want to say that when we look at post-World War II history, Alan kind of alluded to this, I'll be more explicit, that if we look at every presidency since World War II, President Obama ran the largest cyclically adjusted deficits until President Trump 1.0, until President Biden, and now President Trump 2.0 may wind up taking the crown. We're facing a fiscal trifecta that I think is really important to emphasize about how difficult this will be, and this is really my sense of urgency more than what some other people have said about the impending financial crisis, et cetera, that some foresee. That is, we have an urgent need for substantially increased defense spending. Real defense spending this year is $100 billion less than it was 12 years ago, when we weren't worried about Russia and China. Yes, we still were somewhat in Iraq and Afghanistan, but not much. And we also obviously need a much bigger bang for the buck from the Defense Department, but that's an additional story. Secondly, in a few years, we have what you might call the cliffs of the unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare becoming politically salient, when current law would mean that we'd have over a 20% reduction in Social Security benefits according to the schedule. So there will be immense pressure. And the longer we wait, the more likely it is we'll be raising taxes rather than having a more sensible mix of responses, including the possibility of eliminating the cap or raising at a tremendously high level on Social Security income that is taxable under Social Security, which would add a very large discrete increase in marginal tax rates on a very productive part of the population and small businesses. So those things, just to get a sense of it, Social Security and Medicare, we've got, 7, 8, 10 years, depending on whose projections you want to look at. And the longer we wait, the more difficult it will be. So the better we can do in getting our fiscal house in order, the better we'll be able to do now to deal with defense and our non-defense spending, the better we'll be able to deal with that, and the more time we have to make those reforms in Social Security and Medicare, the less disruptive they'll be, and probably the better the ultimate combination of ways we deal with those shortfalls will be. The next point I was making is, Alan kind of essentially alluded to this by his saying that he had been warning about this for some time and not much has happened. But many economists and policymakers have been surprised we haven't had an overt fiscal crisis. Secretary Rubin warned of it all the time, for example, and many others. Yeah, we did have a surge in, a big increase in the price level, a surge in temporary inflation, whether that's John Cochrane's fiscal theory, the price level, we'll debate. But in any event, we haven't had what some have thought was fairly likely from the large run-up in debt. I think the main reason we haven't had that traces back to the old debate between Al Harburger and Marty Feldstein, how open our capital markets were and whether we needed domestic saving to finance our investment, or whether we could have foreign capital, at least for a considerable length of time. And basically, the supply of capital to the United States has proven far more elastic over a far longer period of time than people were thinking about back then when they thought in closed economy terms. Whether that will continue, whether we'll remain innovative enough and have high enough returns and be safe enough and the like, so that will continue, remains to be seen. We are 40% of the global bond market and 40% of the global equity market now. So all that remains to be seen. But what we have are, I will put up one quick thing here to bore you with equations. We have the government's intertemporal borrowing constraint, the present discounted value of the future primary surpluses has to cover the debt, and I would say net of assets, something that is starting to gain attention in Washington. But it doesn't say anything about where along that path they will show up, what happens if we don't, if we wait, et cetera. So it's become very convenient to have the anodyne phrase, and then we have the debt dynamics, different equations, how the debt GDP ratio evolves based on the relationship of the interest payments by the Treasury to the growth rate and the primary surplus. In any event, we've had this anodyne discussion of it being unsustainable, which I view as the basically the political equivalent of, what do I want to say, of less than a rallying cry. Okay, unsustainable is a very anodyne phrase. Then again, economists and policymakers have been crying wolf, and policymakers have found it convenient to kick the can down the road and to shift the burden to future voters, future taxpayers, or to future elected officials to make the tough decisions. I won't go over my discussion. You'll have to read it when the conference volume comes out or get the slides of what real effects the debt may have and the intellectual history of that in economics in the last several decades, tracing back to Bob Mundell and Franco Maiani saying that there was debt illusion, Jim Buchanan saying that it made people vote for bigger spending because they only perceived the tax cost. Jim Tobin saying that there were many different features of government debt as an asset that made it have real effects relative to other assets available, and so on. And the counter-revolution, Robert Barrow, you still here, Robert? In any event, reinstating Ricardian equivalence into people's thinking, the debates about to what extent it holds, and how that, and then Olivier Blanchard's presidential address, basically claiming that we could roll over the debt forever and that there was a big welfare improvement by issuing more debt. I've deconstructed that in the next year in the papers and proceedings if you're interested. I think both of those are not fully descriptive. I think Roberts is a more fundamental question. The Ricardian equivalence is incorporated in a lot of macro models now. I don't view it as compelling as completely, but I do believe that we'd have to shave the traditional estimates of deficit finance spending, crowding out investment dollar for dollar, to something like 50 to 60 cents on the dollar, and there's 40 cents perhaps in round numbers coming from imported capital and private saving. So with that in mind, I do want to turn to a few additional points, okay? And that is, number one, that we shouldn't just look at the deficit and the debt. We have to look at what it's composed of, okay? It makes a difference what we're spending on, whether we're spending on consumption or productive government investment. Let me emphasize productive. We don't have a market test for much government investment, and you can call lots of things investment that have very poor returns. But we do have a large government capital stock, and we have a need for building it up further, especially in the military. When we have sharp swings and the need for that, we did debt finance World War II after all, and much of Reagan's military buildup. And that probably was very wise on standard public finance principles. The next thing I'd say is it's not just the level of taxation, but the structure. It makes a big difference whether you're taxing saving and investment, and whether that's heavily in effective marginal rates, or whether you're doing things that are inframarginal if you're raising revenue, and or if you're taxing consumption. So I think that's important. That leads me to my next point. There's a lot of data that suggests, many studies suggested that increases, at least over a sizable range after some minimum, increase in the debt-GDP ratio will slow long-term growth. The IMF has studies, there are many others. We can go on and on with standard production functions plus the usual analysis of the extent to which debt substitutes for tangible capitals and portfolios and come up with a conclusion. But the basic story is it probably is deleterious. But the last thing you'd want to do is deal with it by a bunch of anti-growth measures that basically delete the purpose or defeat the purpose of slowing the debt. One of the main purposes of slowing the debt-GDP ratio to keep growth going. So I think that really have to pay attention to what the tax structure is and the like. And that gets me to my final point before I get to monetary policy and say a word or two about that. And it's simply this. The best way out of a debt dilemma, and I don't think we'll be able to totally grow our way out of it, the best thing we can do is to maintain a strong growing economy on average over the longer term. There's much that has to be done to deal with that, with the tax structure, yes, with spending and the debt, yes, with entitlement reform, but labor market reform, regulatory reform, all those sorts of things can help. How much they'll be able to help makes a very big difference. The standard estimates of our long-term productivity growth and our long-term GDP growth potential are very low now compared to our history. Partly that's due to slower demographics. If we don't continue to have a lot of immigration into the United States, CBO has been below 2% for some time in their forecast of long-term real GDP potential, compared to 3% or so for much of the post-World War II period. Well, if our fiscal policies and other policies, our generous entitlements, our regulation, et cetera, wind up making that prophecy come true, or it becomes even slower, at a very slow rate of productivity growth, you're not going to have much of an improvement in living standards for our population. And it's going to be even harder still to deal with our more existential needs that HR was pointing out earlier, our need to increase our defense spending, our need to do some of the other things we need to do both publicly and privately. Thank you.
Hanno?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I'm going to talk about the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. And so to do that, I want to set the stage by taking you back to, let me start my stopwatch here, by taking you back to March 2022. That's sort of when the Federal Reserve said, well, we're done expanding our balance sheet to absorb issuance of treasuries and other securities, and central banks and other advanced economies followed suit. And then as sort of the price discovery process resumed in bond markets in advanced economies, what we saw was that there were some hiccups along the way. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, in July of 2022, the Eurozone saw large increases in spreads between core and periphery bond yields. But the example that's been referred to earlier that you probably all know about was the announcement of the trust budget in September of 2022, which was followed by large bond yield increases. France experienced some volatility in the bond market in December of 2024 when the fiscal consolidation plan of Barnier ran into trouble. And then more recently, in March 2025, Germany released its constitutional debt brake in order to increase defense spending, and that gave rise to really large increases in bond yields in the next 24 hours. And then, of course, just a few weeks ago, here in the US, in early April 2025, what we saw was that in response to these tariff announcements, the new tariff plan, US long-term interest rates rose significantly. So between April 4th and April 14th, the spread between 10-year US Treasuries and German bonds increased by about 50 basis points. So that was a big increase. And in most of these cases, and that's what I want to talk about today, market observers, policymakers sort of instinctively reasoned, well, there must be a problem with the functioning of the bond market that may call for intervention. And in fact, in July of 2022, the ECB rolled out preemptively something it called the Transmission Protection Instrument that was designed to suppress spreads that are not driven by fiscal fundamentals, the footprint of market segmentation. In September of 2022, the Bank of England, in fact, briefly resumed its bond purchases just a week after it said it was done purchasing bonds in response to the hiccup in the gilt market after the announcement of the trust budget. So you do see sort of a pattern here. I think that pattern reflects the fact that policymakers and market observers have sort of, over the years now, adopted this view that government debt in advanced economies is safe. And by safe here, I mean, broadly speaking, has sort of zero beta. I'm not just talking about the possibility of default. And then these large yield spikes are just not supposed to happen, even in response to bad fiscal news, just not supposed to happen. If you adopt a safe view of government debt, then in fact what you expect to see is sort of flight to safety, right? That's what we've gotten used to in the US. That's what we saw during the great financial crisis in December of 2008. Investors fled to the safety of treasuries, bidding up the price of treasuries. But that is in fact not what happened in March of 2020. In fact, treasury yields, as I'm sure you remember, increased significantly in early March 2020. It didn't happen in April of 2025. So the last two tests of this sort of flight to safety mechanism, I'd say we didn't pass. Now, if you sort of adhere to the safe debt view, as I said, then these yield spikes are the signature of sort of market dysfunction. And you conclude, well, there's a plumbing problem. And in fact, and Torsten talked about this earlier, in the UK in September 2022, the liquidation of highly levered gilt positions by pension funds was blamed, and I'll come back to that in a second, and that was a problem. Similarly, in April of 2025, market observers here blamed the unwinding of the Treasury basis trade. This is a trade where hedge funds go long, take cash positions in Treasuries, short futures on Treasuries to earn a small basis. And when that basis widens, all of a sudden they're forced to unwind, and that could create upward pressure on yields. Okay. But I would argue, there's a different view. This is a view that is more common in emerging markets, which is, well, you shouldn't take it for granted that government debt is safe because it's backed by something that's quite risky, which is future surpluses. And when governments implement large tax cuts, or spending increases that are not funded by future tax increases or spending decreases, well, then the market value of outstanding debt should be marked down. And yields, in order to do that, will have to increase. This can happen a variety of ways. It can happen by increases in expected inflation, increases in term premia, decreases in the convenience yields, we talked about convenience yields earlier, on government bonds, or even increases in default risk premia, or a combination thereof, right? And so what I want to do now, I'm a business school professor, is give you a little case study of this and to convince you that this really does happen, and it's not always just the plumbing. So let me take you back to the UK, September 2022. On September 22nd, the BOE, announced that they were done purchasing gilts. And then the next day, Friday, September 23rd, the brand new Chancellor of the Exchequer went to the House of Commons to deliver a speech where he announced sweeping tax cuts that were supposed to stimulate economic activity. And what you see here, the dark area, is where the Chancellor starts to address the House of Commons and explains what's in the budget plan. And what you can tell right here is that right away, both the 10-year and the 30-year gilt yields start to go up really significantly. The 10-year nominal yield increases from around 3.5% to 3.7% in a matter of an hour and a half. The 30-year rose significantly, about adding 27 basis points to the yield on the day. And this happened well before there was any problem with the plumbing. Now, subsequently, and this is what Torsten was referring to, there was a real plumbing problem. In the days after that, what happened was that a lot of these liability-driven investment strategies that pension funds had implemented, well, they were losing money, and so these pension funds were getting margin calls. And then what they did in order to meet these margin calls is, in a lot of cases, liquidate these positions, thus further putting upward pressure on yields. But again, the original shock here clearly was fiscal in nature, and it wasn't just all about the plumbing. Then what finally happened in this case is that on September 28th, the Bank of England said, well, we're going to resume purchasing gilts, even though just a week before that they had said that they were done. And then finally, the way this story ends is that in early October, the tax plan was abandoned, and the Prime Minister, as I'm sure you recall, was actually forced to resign. And after that, gilt yields, of course, came permanently down. But it sort of does beg the question, well, what would the Bank of England have done if this tax plan had not been abandoned? Which brings me to COVID-19, which I think is kind of illustrative and provides a cautionary tale. Between March 9th and March 18, 2020, here in the US, 10-year US Treasury yields increased by 68 basis points as bond markets were slowly starting to digest the largest post-war fiscal shock that was about to occur. And some economists pointed out correctly that primary dealers in the US had trouble absorbing all of the treasuries that were being sold by market participants. They were running out of balance sheet capacity, and then these events triggered massive intervention by the Fed and central banks around the world. On March 15th, the Fed Open Market Committee announced that they were going to start purchasing treasuries to support the smooth functioning of treasury markets. And if I can direct your attention to that slide, what you see there in the right-hand side panel is the purchases of notes and bonds, so excluding T-bills. The red area, that's the rest of the world. The rest of the world didn't really help us in COVID, as you probably know. In fact, they were selling early on. And so the Fed actually ended up absorbing more than issuance for 4 quarters at the start of COVID between March 2020 and March 2021. And of course, that begs the question, well, we sort of started all this to address a plumbing problem, but if we were concerned about market functioning, then how did absorbing all of the issuance for 4 quarters improve market function? Maybe it actually potentially impaired price discovery and sent the wrong signal to fiscal policymakers, and this brings me to fiscal policy, about how much fiscal capacity they really had. Because ultimately, fiscal policymakers rely on the bond market to tell them. And that requires a price discovery process that works. So ultimately, central banks and governments can coordinate on a safe debt regime in which bondholders are protected from fiscal shocks, but then taxpayers have to bear the burden. And that rules out unfunded spending and tax cuts. Alternatively, they can coordinate on a risky debt regime that protects taxpayers, but then that exposes bondholders to fiscal risk. But you can't really do both. There's a choice there. And ultimately, I guess, and that's the point I want to emphasize, it's important that policymakers, central bankers particularly, use the right model of government debt when they're judging whether the bond market is functioning and whether sustained intervention is called for. And this brings me to my final point. As was pointed out by Alan earlier, the US federal government is not on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. In the baseline case, the CBO projects the federal government will be running primary deficits until 2053. Federal debt held by the public in the baseline scenario is projected to hit 153% in 2053, but that doesn't include an extension, as Alan pointed out, of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. If that is extended, then the debt-GDP ratio, according to the CBO, again, in 2053 would exceed 200%, 47 percentage points higher than in the baseline scenario. So, price discovery process in treasury markets ensures that fiscal fundamentals are priced in. That imposes discipline on fiscal policy. If government debt really is risky, then occasionally large yield increases may be appropriate in response to adverse fiscal news. That's part of the price discovery process. The risk is if central banks use the wrong model of government debt, then they may end up using their balance sheet to continue to absorb a lot of the issuance, to fix a sequence of plumbing problems, and then, as in the case of Japan, ultimately you may fundamentally impair the price discovery process in the bond market altogether, potentially at a great cost to taxpayers and to savers. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to talk about fiscal monetary interaction. We've got the world is ending signs, which I don't need to repeat because it's been done so beautifully, but how does that affect a monetary policy? So we need to remember inflation is always and everywhere a joint monetary and fiscal policy interaction. And what are the channels? The most obvious that we know all is that in a time of big deficits, there's pressure on the central bank to finance those deficits or to hold down interest costs on the debt. And not necessarily pressure. During the pandemic, the Fed monetized about $3 trillion of debt, and totally voluntarily. There wasn't an independence issue because they diagnosed the problem the same way the Treasury did. But there was, monetization for, that's something that's a fiscal and monetary thing that happened together. Getting out of it, higher interest rates to fight inflation create additional deficits because of the interest cost on the debt. And at 100% debt to GDP, that's big. A 1% real interest rate is 1% more GDP interest cost. That's 1% of GDP more deficit, and that's deficit fuel on the inflation fire if you don't do something about it. There's a windfall to bondholders. If you do bring down inflation, you're paying back long-term bondholders in more valuable money. That, too, is significant with a large amount of debt. And, of course, if the Fed raises real interest rates, the whole point is to go through softening the economy, Phillips curve, blah, blah, blah. And that is going to induce bailouts, stimulus, automatic stabilizers, additional deficits. Every single model we have describes disinflation as a joint monetary fiscal contraction because fiscal policy has to tighten to pay all of those costs. Even if you're New Keynesian, you say passive fiscal policy, footnote 4, lump sum taxes take care of it all. Those lump sum taxes must happen. And if they don't happen, and they're big, you cannot lower inflation. And I want to show you that. Here's some graphs to make that point. So I claimed that every single model is joint monetary fiscal, and without the fiscal contraction, the Fed cannot lower inflation. Here's the New Keynesian model. Taylor rule, Taylor principle, selecting equilibria, the top left one, the standard New Keynesian IS Phillips curve and Taylor rule. No fiscal theory funny business here. Even I know how to compute these models too, I haven't forgotten. So it's perfectly standard. There's an AR1 shock, that's the U on the top. Interest rate goes up, inflation goes down. Yaha, that's a disinflation. But notice the interest rate is higher than the inflation. There's a long period of high real interest rates here. Those are real interest costs on the debt. Someone's got to pay them. Let's look at footnote 4. Aha, passive fiscal policy raises lump sum taxes, in this case by 5.9% of the value of the debt to pay those interest costs. On the right, I did totally standard New Keynesian model. I ask of the model, okay, I want to find a U, a monetary policy disturbance, that produces exactly the same interest rate path. Notice the interest rate, the different vertical scales, the interest rate comes down as an AR1. Those interest rate paths are the same, but choose a different, there are many different shocks that produce the same interest rate. Of those, pick a shock series that involves no fiscal policy contraction. So Fed, do what you can, but you call Congress and say, I want 5.9% of GDP more surpluses, and they say, ha, ha, ha. Well, here's what happens. Totally standard New Keynesian models, different shock process, same interest rate. Look, inflation goes up. Without the fiscal tightening to pay the interest costs on the debt, inflation goes up when the central bank raises interest rates, and this is the totally standard New Keynesian model. And you can eyeball it. You can see that the pi and the I lines are about this, so the present value of the real interest rates are 0. Here's the fiscal theory of the price level model with New Keynesian model. Notice the graphs look exactly the same. They are exactly the same. You can interpret the same calculations in multiple ways. Here, the Fed picks the interest rate path. That's the thing we observe. There are many possible inflation equilibria with that fiscal path, that interest rate path. Fiscal policy picks which one of the equilibria we get by how much surpluses they're willing to give. On the left, fiscal policy tightens 5.9%. On the right, fiscal policy says, we're not doing it. And then we pick a different inflation equilibrium. Without the fiscal tightening, inflation goes up. The fiscal, and as sort of an embarrassment here, it is the tightening, the equilibrium selection, the fiscal policy that does all the disinflation. Higher interest rates in the New Keynesian model, without that equilibrium selection business, raise inflation. You need the fiscal policy. Here's adaptive expectations, good old ISLM. The model's on the left. On the left, notice I've got pi t minus 1s, where there should be et pi t plus 1s. That's how the old-fashioned model works. Higher interest rates raise the real interest rate. That pushes that pushes output down. Output down pushes inflation down going forwards. The standard story told to undergraduates. And this is I've got a Taylor rule in here as well. So what happens? Raise the interest rate. As you raise the interest rate, and inflation starts to go down looking forward. Real interest rates are high. That pushes inflation down. But following the Taylor rule, the interest rate then follows the inflation down, and we restabilize at a lower level. The standard story of what happened in 1980. But wait a minute. Look at the interest rate relative to the inflation. There are positive interest costs on the debt here. In fact, this graph here, the magenta line graphs what happened to the discounted value of the debt, which has to go to 0. It's not going to 0 if nobody pays those interest costs on the debt. In this model, too, if there is no change in fiscal policy to pay those interest costs on the debt, higher interest rates cannot lower inflation. And the reason is higher real interest rates push inflation down. Okay, that works, but then we've racked up interest costs on the debt. The only way to not pay those interest costs on the debt is to have negative real interest rates for a while to bring the debt value back down, but that brings the inflation back up again. You cannot lower inflation unless fiscal policy pays the interest costs on the debt. This is the best I can do. The unpleasant, this is a unpleasant interest rate arithmetic. It's no change in fiscal policy, but the Fed can do some good here, raise the interest rate. What that has is the unpleasant interest rate arithmetic. You can inflate in the future, raise lower long-term bond prices, make short-term bonds more valuable, and disinflate now. Notice what the Fed can do is move inflation through time without fiscal help. We're not lowering inflation durably, but you can move around through time. And that's a great and good thing to do. That can help smooth inflation. But without fiscal help, you can't bring inflation down forever. The 1980s were a joint monetary and fiscal disinflation. 1980 is like the poster case for monetary policy came in. And by the way, are we here is a very interesting question. 1979 was, there was a big inflation that came and went in 1976. Then a big supply shock came in 1979, and our central bankers were facing the same supply shock now. I think we were a little embarrassed about how much accommodation we did back then. I'm worried about, are we running right into 1979? But let's move on to 1982. Yes, interest rates went up, inflation came down, just like that graph I showed you. But look, interest rates above inflation, high interest costs on the debt. Great deal if you bought bonds. In graduate school, when I was in 1982 in graduate school, I wish I had bought bonds at 15% yields and get paid off when the CPI had gone down to 5%. Who paid those? Taxpayers paid those. The 1980s had a fiscal and monetary reform. During the night, there was a Social Security reform. Heavens, a Social Security reform where we saw the looming crisis and put that present value of long-term future surpluses back on a sustainable path for another 40 years. There was a tax reform. There was deregulation. There was growth. So the present value of surpluses did pay for the disinflation. And there's the surpluses down below. There were deficits, small primary deficits in the 1980s, but then look at the late 80s, the 90s, early 90s, and late 90s. The surpluses came in, the present value of surpluses did it. It was a joint fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic reform. And many times, especially in Latin America, they've tried to raise interest rates without solving the fiscal problem. You get a little bit of inflation going down for a while, and then boom, 1976 turns into 1979. So what about the shadow of debt? What is the real problem? As I see it, the big problem is the fiscal space, not so much just the trundling along, but the fiscal space of what do we do to react to a shock. What happens when there are crises? When the Fed wants to raise interest rates, do we have the fiscal space to pay higher interest costs on the debt? If there's a geopolitical crisis, which we've been talking about, is there the fiscal space for the Treasury to borrow all the money it needs? Now, there's good and bad news here. What counts is the present value of surpluses. You do not need a couple years of austerity. You do not need gimmicks. In fact, everything that matters is outside of the budget window. It's okay to borrow if there is credible future surpluses. What you need is the credibility that you're going to go back to some sort of normal policy, decades of small primary surpluses, or even slightly negative primary surpluses if you've got some exorbitant privileges. That 1% liquidity, you can even have a little bit negative, but they got to get small again. On the other hand, long-term surpluses, they have to come from growth, spending, and marginal reform. High marginal tax rates, you can grab some money now, but if you kill growth just a little bit, you've killed your tax revenue going out 20 to 30 years. So you don't need short-run austerity. You don't need capital taxes. The long-run Laffer curve is not about labor leisure. It's about investments that pay off in growth 20 or 30 years from now. Now, there's a fiscal monetary coordination going on over in Europe as well, and I want to advertise a book that Luis, who's here, and Klaus Masuka and I have coming out in June on the euro. There's fiscal monetary coordination written for you. The euro is a wonderful invention. There's a problem if you have a currency union, a temptation for countries to borrow and then say, oh no, we can't pay back. ECB, hello, bail us out, print some money. The architects of the euro understand this beautifully, and especially given 1990s, really admirably. They structured it with some really good rules against this problem. Central bank is independent. It has an inflation mandate, a tradition nearly legal of we don't buy government debt, a no bailout clause among the member states, debt and deficit limits. They really thought about it. But a couple little items were left a little bit unstated because on your wedding night, you really don't want to write the 15th clause of the prenup. We'll figure it out later, honey, which is what they did. And the biggest one is, if a member state does get in trouble, do they default like a company or do they not default? And we didn't, and there was no mechanism for default because we don't really want to talk about default. They treated government debt as risk-free for banks, But on the other hand, there wasn't clear that there was any way for them to never, ever default. Well, we'll figure that out. Unfortunately, a sequence of crises came that no one imagined at the time. The financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, QE, COVID, and so forth. And each time, the ECB was kind of stuck. They're the only game in town, and we got to bail out by government debts and so forth. But now we're kind of stuck. There's a big balance sheet. There's a lot of moral hazard. Everyone expects the ECB to step in and tamp down problems in the future. Italy borrows and goes on a super bonus binge. That's a good joke for another time, or over beer. So it's time to bottle up the moral hazard. And that's the point of our book, and I won't give you now, especially as John is looking nervous, a long list of reforms. So my closing comment is, when we put this together, we thought about fiscal monetary. Of course, tariff monetary policy is the big issue now. And there are two issues I think worth talking about. First, tariffs are a supply shock. So the tariff monetary thing is, what are you going to, you get to go back, central bankers, and relive 1979 or 2022 and get a chance to say, boy, here's how I might have done it differently in unpleasant times. But the deeper problem is the tariff international financial monetary shock. If foreigners cannot get dollars via trade, they cannot buy our treasuries. If they cannot buy our treasuries, then the US must, boom, today, set savings equal investment, balance the budget. That means massive cuts in consumption, and the way you have massive cuts in the consumption is the government stops sending people checks in order to finance their consumption. Interest rates spike in order to get that savings equal investment. Be careful what you wish for, you might just get it.
Well, we have time for questions or comments. Maybe I'll gather a batch here first, right up there. And if we could have another one here, Sebastian, down here. State your name first, please.
Larry Ball, Johns Hopkins University. So I think there's a pretty persuasive case that we're on this unsustainable path. So the debt GDP ratio is 100%, it'll be 134% in 10 years, then 168%, then 200%. And, there's a political deadlock that means we'll never get off it, that path. And assume, actually, there isn't any, special mistake like a Mar-a-Lago Accord or, we hit the debt ceiling in default. Suppose we just plod along with 3% primary deficits a year. So I think we know that, at some point before the debt GDP ratio reaches infinity, there will be a sudden flight from treasuries and an unimaginable financial crisis, and the world economy will collapse. So, in between 100% and, infinity, is there any way to have informed speculation about, is the 134% going to do it, or does it have to be 500%, or is just any way to think about sort of at what point do we fall off the edge of the earth if we keep going?
So let's hold on that question and gather a few. We have Sebastian here.
Yeah, I'm tempted to answer Larry Ball's question and say the number is 260%, which comes from Japan. But the panel knows more than I. I have a question based on Hanno's presentation, but everyone or anyone. Hanno said there is a plumbing problem, and we hear this all the time. The equity market crashed, and bond yields went up. And Hanno added the dollar went down. But then there was nothing on the dollar in your presentation after just mentioning it. Now, if I look at the dollar, it lost 3.3%, which is nothing. And it's still 11% higher than before the pandemic. So I think that you are bad-mouthing the dollar for no reason. So that's the question.
Vicky?
So this whole discussion about is debt sustainable, the notion is eventually something really bad's going to happen. Higher inflation, higher interest rates. But for all of the reasons that Michael Boskin described to us, it's having the effect now. it's not we have to wait in the future where somehow we're going to fall off a cliff, but the impact is now. And the impact is all about how we're allocating national resources. If we did have a much lower debt to GDP, like pre-financial crisis, we would have already allocated more for defense and you would have been happier. So it's not just the allocation of national resources, but the way we're allocating resources now through providing significant income support is very likely reducing labor supply and economic growth right now. So let me just toss out two statistics. We've tremendously broadened the eligibility for Medicaid. Right now, there are 73 million people receiving Medicaid. Costs $880 billion a year right now. The SNAP program, 42 million people are on it. That costs $113 billion last year. To what extent is this affecting labor supply now, particularly at a time when some of us are concerned about future immigration? And so it's having this effect right now, and I would just add one other thing. Of course, it's been the compounding of the indexed entitlement programs. But even if we go back to the 1990s, when we talked about Graham-Rudman 1 and 2 and 3, and all the ways to reduce deficits, it was all about non-defense discretionary, and everything else was off the table. And so the word entitlements in budget process has evolved into mandatory spending. And so the whole process needs to be changed. But I just want to emphasize this point that we're feeling it's having a big impact right now. So we don't even have to posit the idea that, is debt sustainable? Because it's having a big impact on economic performance as we speak.
Thank you, Mickey. We have time. We have probably time to gather two more questions, then we'll go back to the panel.
Hi, Patrick Keogh. So I guess this is for Mike and Alan. Some states, like Utah, have done a particularly good job of following close to a balanced budget rule by separating their budgets into operating expenses and general investment funds. And you can bond it if you can make the case that it's seriously a useful investment. Otherwise, it's closer to pay-go on that. Obviously, you couldn't get the US government to go for that right away, but could you at least redo the accounting principles for how government budgets are broken down and explained, and with the idea of shooting towards that kind of principles, namely, if it's normal government expenditure, it's supposed to be close to pay-go, and if it's infrastructure, et cetera, investment, and you don't play games with what's an investment and what's not, and you got to be very careful about that, could even presenting it that way as a desired goal and then moving towards it. Some of the Latin American countries who got out of their problems worked their way into reforms by explaining to the people and then later did a hard transition. Is that too hopeful, or is there any chance? Thank you.
One more right down here, Michelle.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. Isabel Schnabel, European Central Bank. So I have one comment on Hanno's presentation and one on John's. So Hanno, you had this slide on the different market dysfunctions, and it included the episode of March of this year when Germany announced its fiscal package. But I would actually argue that that is a very different type of episode, because what you saw there was no market dysfunction. And actually, everybody was happy that Germany was taking up more debt, and it was even seen as, fostering German growth prospects. So I think that's a very different type of episode. I wouldn't include it in that type of list. Then on John, I mean, of course, you've written this fascinating book, certainly a bit controversial at times, but very important for the debate. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that, I mean, the euro area is a very complex structure because we have a single monetary policy, but we have 20 sovereign states with separate fiscal policies, and that makes it quite complicated. And when there are shocks, I mean, what has happened many times is that we've seen that sovereign spreads have moved in a destabilizing fashion. And that for us as a central bank is a very complicated situation because it immediately has implications for the monetary policy transmission because you immediately get very different interest rates in the different parts of the euro area. And this is why we have, over time, designed different tools in order to deal with this. And these tools are not perfect, but they also shouldn't be kind of portrayed as tools that are there simply to compress the spreads. Actually, they have quite a few safeguards. So you have the OMT with ex-post conditionality, you have the TPI with ex-ante conditionality, and there are many things that we try to do in order to deal with the issues that you also raise. And then, of course, we also shouldn't forget that there is a fiscal framework. Again, it's not perfect, and it's not always working. But in any case, and if you look, actually, Hanno also mentioned the French episode. And there you see, when there are fundamental issues in particular countries, you do see movements in spreads. It's not correct that we've kind of ironed out all the spread movements. So there is market discipline, maybe not as much as there would have been otherwise, but market discipline is actually there.
So we've had a good set of questions, some direct to Hanno, and but why don't we go from the end? John, it's a smorgasbord. Take your pick.
Okay. Quickly to Larry's question, because I think is like one of the most important. Not to say Isabel's is most important for Europe, Larry's is most important for the U.S. What's unsustainable will not happen. And so this is not, that projection is going to happen. The only question is, how is it not going to happen? And is it going to be easy or hard? And if we see these forecasts, why is the bond market still holding U.S. debt? Why don't we face Argentinian or Greek levels of interest rates? Well, I think the bond market figures the U.S. is a great country. Sooner or later, after we've tried everything else, we'll do the right thing again. Because this is not hard. A commission made up of 5 randomly chosen people in this room could come up with a program to solve this thing in about 10 minutes flat, especially if you cross out politically feasible in today's political environment, because the minute there's a crisis, the political environment changes completely. And I think our government will do this. We have to close a little optimistic. I think Alan pointed out we don't respond to the debt, but our government responds to interest costs, just like Joe and Jane. Joe and Jane, the credit card company says, "Hugh, you can borrow 2%," or for governments, -2%. And they say, "Yeah, let's buy the new car, buy the new house." "Oh, interest costs are 5%. We got to cut back." So I am hopeful that once again there will be a time of reform before that our government will not shoot itself in the foot and go down a completely needless debt crisis, because there's no external shock. This is all internally done. Of course, Isabel, you're exactly right about the euro, but sometimes spreads are fundamental and default spreads, and those market signals need to go back to governments to say, hey, you got to watch yourself a little bit. Corporate spreads are sometimes default spreads. Country spreads could be default spreads, and there isn't really a mechanism. The banks are still completely loaded up with sovereign debt, so that it's very hard to have a sovereign default. So there's still a problem there. You're doing your best, but let's get together and fix the structural problem so it's easier to be the ECB. I mean, that's our basic job. Make your life easier.
Hanno?
Thank you. Okay, let me start by taking a stab at Sebastian's point, which I think is an interesting one. You were sort of saying, well, at the end of the day, between April 4th and April 14th, the dollar only depreciated by, say, 3 or 4%. That's not a big deal. But it happened when, at the same time, U.S. long-term interest rates were rising a lot relative to, say, German interest rates. I think the increase in that spread was about 50 basis points. And so based on standard economics and just recent history, what you would have expected was a strong appreciation of the dollar just on the basis of what was happening to the interest rate difference. I've done some work recently with Arvind Krishnamurthy and a bunch of other co-authors where we attribute this to the decline in convenience yields. So we've talked about this. The US is the world's safe asset supplier. The dollar is the reserve currency. One measure of this is if you take a German Bund, 10-year German Bund, and you hedge it into dollars, historically that synthetic US Treasury was always more expensive than the real thing, or vice versa. The yield on the synthetic Treasury was higher. That's not true any longer. And I think, and this perhaps is a beginning of an answer to Larry's question, I think that's concerning. So you can do this at the 1-year, 5-year, 10-year horizon. You take German yields, hedge them into dollars compared to US Treasury yields. The US Treasury yields and the actual Treasuries are now higher at all tenors. That's a completely new development, even at the 1-year horizon. I think that's concerning because it suggests that it's no longer true that, say, European investors are willing to pay a little bit extra for the safety of dollar-denominated US Treasuries. That has big implications for fiscal policy as well, I think. So I think that's an important fact. And then let me just say that I agree with Isabel that the German episode, I was actually showing that to show that there are lots of examples recently where bond markets respond to fiscal shocks. And I think that in a lot of cases, is exactly what should happen. And I think that's, so I think we're in agreement on what was happening there. To your broader point, I'm more skeptical than you are about whether in the Eurozone we're really letting markets dictate what happens to spreads when you see that in equilibrium, a large price inelastic investor is absorbing a lot of the issuance, and this is not just true in the Eurozone, it's true here as well to some extent, and I'm skeptical about those market prices. The example that I always revert back to is Japan. In Japan, the Bank of Japan for the last decade has absorbed almost all of the issuance. Do I think that, until recently, do I think that the long end of the yield curve was particularly informative there about fiscal capacity, true fiscal capacity? No, not really. I think it was a giant exercise of financial repression, which is very costly for Japanese depositors who are saving at the short-term interest rate. So that's my
Great, thank you. Michael?
Yeah, a few comments. First of all, while we've all worried about what the deficit and debt may do and how it evolves and the pressure it might put to inflate, et cetera, we haven't ever mentioned that the Fed has adopted a lot of fiscal policies that are, to say, to be generous, stretch its Section 13.3 authority, et cetera, that now it's been assigned that, or it's been asked to do that, et cetera, but there's a question of what makes sense for the Fed to be doing as an institution, whether that's jointly in Cochranian concert with the fiscal authorities, but just FYI, we should not let that go unmentioned. On the question of where we're going to hit the fan, the most famous forecast, the most famous person who went out on the limb and said there was a big cliff was at 90% of GDP. That was Ken Rogoff at Harvard. And that came and went, and it turned out there was a mathematical mistake in the calculations. But in any event, nobody knows for sure. However, we do know, I mean, simple analysis tells you there's got to be an upper limit on the fraction of wealth people will be willing to hold, and say in dollar securities, for example. Okay, they're not going to hold all of it for diversification reasons, all right? And there are many other things that would be way under 100%, what's going on in their economy, what they need to transact, et cetera. But the key is, before we get there, you know, the supply of capital to the US is going to become more inelastic. So interest rates are going to rise more rapidly, real interest rates are going to rise more rapidly. So we have to pay close attention to that, I think. I think anybody tells you exactly know where they think they know where that is, or that it's independent of every other country having analogous problems in various, a greater or lesser degree, I think has probably been inhaling. So I think we just can't say for sure, but we do know that we know there are icebergs out there, and the wise path isn't to keep going, let alone to what we're doing now, speed up, but to alter somewhat of a different course. We're having obviously trouble doing that. And on Pat's point, I developed capital accounts for the federal government when I was a young scholar, and OMB took them over. You can argue what kind of a job they're doing, et cetera. And as I said, we don't have market transactions to discipline those investments. But I think there's an opportunity there if we can hold the rigor about what really is tangible capital. That, I think, is the big risk, that you get some, let's say, a government that wants to have a very expansive definition of human capital, and all transfer payments are helping people, and that's improving their human capital, whether they just consume it or rather than they get educated or do job training or anything. So, so I think it has some possibilities. I actually proposed this in the 1980s to President Reagan in a meeting, and he loved the idea because he quickly figured out that that would make it a little more palatable to finance a big defense buildup. But it got scuttled when Cap Weinberger, then the defense secretary, went haywire when he realized we'd have to take depreciation into the operating budget. And his answer was, we'd be giving the Russians all these secrets. So that's how we didn't get President Reagan deciding he'd like to see us start, at least present the stuff that way, if whether or not we're going to do, whether we're actually going to budget that way, at least present the material that way.
Alan?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on that last point. I think as much as I think reforming budget measures and concepts is useful, I think the main thing that distinguishes state behavior from the federal government is that states are much more subject to the discipline of capital markets than the federal government. States have adopted on their own, without any constraints imposed, balanced budget rules. That the capital budget is really part of the balanced budget rules, because that's really the only way that you can borrow, except for very, very short-term fluctuations. And that wasn't just because they were good government types. It's because they wanted to retain access to capital markets. And they also have a much bigger problem of potential labor mobility. If they're a failed state, they'll lose people. And so I think, however well we measure concepts at the federal level, if the market doesn't impose discipline on the federal government, and if there's nothing else built into the politicians to be fiscal conservatives, I don't think it's really going to help very much.
Well, great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Just one quick quip. Since we've been so pessimistic, I want to just say, the optimist says things can't get much worse. The pessimist says, oh yes, they can.
Since we're over time, let's start at 5 on the dot.
Yeah.
Policy panel.
Great.
Get a little-
Okay.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the panel.